amazing summer we've had. I think choir starts back a week from next Sunday. So just thank you all for contributing such great special music. It's really special to see husbands and wives, and mothers and daughters, and now uncle and niece, and Blake. Life is absurd if you think about it. You know, especially these days. We used to live in booming metropolis of Bean Blossom, Indiana, which I know Gail knows, by the Bluegrass Festival or Blues Fest. Bean Blossom, the home of the Bill Monroe Park, and they do music festivals. Jack and I used to live there. One of the things I miss about it the most was this place called Shopworth. Shopworth was this small grocery store that we could walk to just up the street from us. And it was run by a family, and in particular this older gentleman who's now departed, simply named Jack. And the thing about Shopworth, the Shopworth was never locked because Jack lost the key. So they never locked Shopworth. If you went to Shopworth, you would often run into a chicken in the aisle, and not in a package, but a real feathered chicken walking in. But what I miss about Shopworth is it was a small grocery store. It had everything you needed and just what you needed. You didn't have to spend time in Shopworth, looking at 5 different kinds of Cheez-Its, Cheese Nips. You didn't have to stand in front of the dairy aisle and all the mild cheddars, all the cheeses there. You didn't have to choose from 5 million cans of soup. You only got what Shopworth stocked, period. And it made your grocery shopping that much simpler. But think of how absurd it is to go to Meijer or go to one of these big Krogers and just look at all the aisles. How many different kinds of green corn do you need to choose between? When probably one brand, one can would work. How many different kinds of American singles do you need when Kraft is the best? Think of just how absurd it gets, even just going to grocery shopping and all these choices we have. How absurd is it that we have streaming music now? I mean, it's really cool. I love, the digital music age. But I've got an iPod, and I've got, a couple things downloaded on it, but I have room for 892 songs. I've got this figured out to a science. It's absurd that I spent 2 hours of my life yesterday picking out the perfect 892 songs to put on my iPod. When you just used to pick out a 45 and drop a needle on a record, right? It's absurd that I spent that much time. It's absurd if you go out to a restaurant and you look around you that you have entire families staring at their phone the whole time. How absurd is that? It's absurd. How absurd is it that we schedule our lives based on time clocks and program schedules on TV? How absurd is it that we watch reality TV and care? How absurd is that? How absurd is the amount of time that you spend on Facebook as opposed to the time that you spend with other people? I could go on and on, but you have to agree with me that if you really think about life as we live it today, that if we just judge it by the things that we do and that we waste time on, it is simply absurd the way we live our lives. And guess what? The guy who wrote Ecclesiastes had that figured out a long time ago. He said it was vanity. And not only that, he said it was vanity of vanities. What he meant was that life is vain to the nth degree. And to emphasize something, you would put like holy of holies, meaning that God is the most holy that God can be. And here, vanity of vanities means that of all things, life is the most absurd thing that there is out there, if viewed by everything that happens under the sun. That's what I have to specify here at the beginning when we talk about Solomon, is that Solomon isn't saying that life in general is absurd. That word he's using is Hebel. And Hebel can be translated vanity, as Robbie read so well this morning, or like I'm referring to it as Habel also means absurd. And what the teacher says, or Solomon is traditionally known as his teacher, is that if you think about all the things that happen under the sun, then if you think about it, life is absurd. It makes no sense whatsoever. But implied in these passages that I want to talk about for the next few minutes is that implied in this passage from chapter 1 and chapter 3, that amid all the absurdity in life, we can still find meaning. But the first thing we have to do, number one, is that we have to look for more than what happens under the sun. This is a big theme. Vanity is a big word. It's repeated 50 times throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, but also this phrase, under the sun, gets repeated over and over again. And so what the teacher is wrestling with is the idea of life as we know it, as we experience it, as reason can attain it. And the teacher says that all is vanity and that people have little to gain under the sun. But again, it's location that the teacher wants us to consider, is that if we just view our lives in the number of cheese choices that we have, if we just view our lives as revealed to us on a time clock, if we just view our lives as to what our favorite programming or music is, if we just view our lives based on what happens under the sun in the sphere of this world, then it really doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't make a difference in the grand scheme of things. Looking at life as more than under the sun means seeing life beyond what it appears or beyond what can be explained. Let me say that again. In order to seek meaning in the absurdity of life, we have to look beyond the sun, what lies under the sun. What that means is seeing life beyond what it appears or can be explained. I don't know if you all follow NASA like I do, as I waste time on Twitter. But they discovered a planet in the Kevlar belt, I think it's called, and they're really Kuiper belt, thank you. And they're really excited because it falls what's in the range of the Goldilocks zone. And if you don't know what the Goldilocks zone is that is the perfect distance for a planet to be away from a star to possibly host life. And so they found this planet. It's right there in the Goldilocks ring. The Earth turns, I think, in 395 days instead of 365. And there's a great possibility, if we ever got there, because it's like 14 million trillion light years away, that there might be life on that planet because it fits the scientific definition of the Goldilocks zone that we find ourselves in. Wasn't that really boring? It's not boring, it's exciting. But I would rather, thinking of our own Earth and thinking about creation, is that I've always thought that it is a lot more fun and fulfilling to think that we are some sort of miracle. That we are here, not because of the Goldilocks zone, not because of science, but we are here right now because we are the product of a creative miracle. For me, that is so much more rewarding in my life than just thinking we are the product of a cosmic coincidence. When we reduce life and science to just science and facts and natural order, we miss out on something really special. Because isn't it a lot more fun to be part of a creative miracle than a cosmic coincidence? To say that the reason we're here is because God chose that we would be here right now, and under these circumstances for life to exist. I could explain that sunsets happen because the earth revolves around the sun, though people didn't used to believe that, and that the reason the sun sets is because we orbit. But instead, I like to refer to a sunset as an artistic masterpiece. I like to see beyond the science of sunsets and see something that's beautiful and wondrous and just awesome. That's beginning to look at our life beyond the sun. I still get fascinated about the science and, all the discoveries that we make. But when it comes down to it in my life, what gives my life meaning is I choose to look beyond facts with faith and see beauty and see miracles and to see wonder and to see such awesomeness that I can only ascribe to God. our Creator. So in the absurdity of life, how can we find meaning? We have to look, beyond what things appear or what can be explained and look for things like beauty and wonder. But that second thing we have to do is make God the reason. Let me throw that phrase up there real quick and I'll come back to it. But the second thing we have to do to find meaning is we have to make God the reason. The teacher, or Solomon, says that there is a fixed time for everything that happens. A time to be born and a time to die. Everything that Robbie read following that pretty much fits into those two categories until the teacher ends that poem with saying there is a time for war, but ultimately there is a time for peace. The teacher says that there is a fixed time for everything that happens in our life. The good news, the teacher discovered, was that God has made everything sufficient for its time. That God has made everything perfect for its time. So that's the good news. God has made everything suitable or sufficient. The bad news is, he goes on to say that no matter how hard we think about it, we'll never figure out what God has done from the beginning. Is that as much as it is great news to know that there's a fixed time for everything that happens, that God somehow also sustains and makes suitable, that no matter how hard we try, we will never be able to figure out the whys. What I've learned in my life, and from being a pastor, is that things happen. We can't stop that from happening. Things happen. We are born, we die. We die. There are times to gather stones, there are times to cast away stones. There are times to sow, there are times to mend. In our lives, things like that happen. There are times that we gain, and there are times that we lose. We cannot stop that from happening, because things happen. And maybe things just happen randomly. Or maybe there's a reason that things happen, why and when they do. The problem is, only God knows the answer to that. And no matter how hard we try to make sense of the things that happen in our life, we'll never fully understand why. So making God the reason means that instead of asking, why did this happen? How oftentimes when things happen, do you sit around and you spend your time asking God, why did this happen? Why did this happen? You know what's the better question if we make God the reason? Is to ask the question of who. We're going to get stuck asking the whys. We're never going to get the answers until we have our great sit down with Jesus up in heaven. And at that point, my friends, guess what? It's not going to matter. So we can waste our life in empty vanity, asking why, or we can begin asking the question, who is going to get me through this? I put this on Facebook and Twitter, but I believe, and you all might disagree with me on this one, but that's okay. I think the statement, God must have God's reasons, is cheap and unproductive response when people suffer a loss. I believe that to be true. God must have God's reasons doesn't help. What does help is making God the reason that you move forward as time marches on. Because the truth is, even if God does have a reason, we're never going to do that. And I've been with a lot of people. Let me tell you one story. I may have told this before, but it's been like 12 summers ago, if you can believe that. I spent the summer as a hospital chaplain at Bloomington Hospital. And I had to do that as part of my seminary. So I spent pretty much the whole summer as a full-time chaplain. Wore a pager, so I did work overnight shifts. And I had my rounds that I would go on. And I was up on one of the floors, and they brought in a young man who had been in a car wreck. And as it happens when these things happen to teenagers, he had a lot of visitors. There were a lot of people in the lobby, and there were people coming and going all day in this young man's room. And I kept trying to go in, to see him and to check on him, because the story goes he and his friend were out late one night, just picking up a motorcycle. Hadn't been drinking, really, they weren't speeding. They had just gone, at that night, were driving home late with a motorcycle on a trailer in the back, and either the driver nodded off, or, they just weren't familiar with where they were, went off the road, hit a tree, killed the driver instantly, and left this young man, with a broken collarbone, which was bad because he was a star baseball player. And he was a junior in high school, and he was, in a rough shot. His life had changed. The whole family's life had changed in losing a son. This changed in knowing that his friend was right next to him in the car. And so finally, I wait till the evening when all the crowd kind of starts, dying down, going to visit him. And I walk into his room and, ask how he's doing, and said, I knew, some of his story. And said, I just want to touch base and see how you're holding up. And he looked at me and he said, the thing I can't understand is why I just can't accept that all these people have been coming into my room, in and out, in and out, in and out, and they keep telling me that God must have had a reason. And I can't figure that out. I can't accept that. And that's where he was stuck. And so I looked at him, and usually when I'm in situations like that, I try to ask more questions than I do give any advice. So I looked at this young man, 17-year-old, is broken and banged up and really awakened to how serious life can be. And I looked at him and I said, can you think of one good reason why God would take your friend away at this moment in his life? And to take him away from his mother and from all of his friends. Can you think of one good reason why God would do that? And the young man looked at me and said, no. I said, then quit trying. We're never going to figure out a good reason for why those things happen. But what we can do is make God the reason that we continue living our lives, as your friend would want. That's what I'm trying to say here, is that sometimes, maybe it's not that God has a reason, or maybe we're never going to understand that. But the best thing we can do is to make God the reason. So then no matter what happens in our life, we know that we can move on. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be without challenges. It's not going to be without all those times of sorrow. But if we make God the reason, we can get through anything and live our lives forward. In the absurdity of life, we find meaning when we look at life as more than what happens under the sun. We find meaning when we make God the sole reason that we move forward along the slow march of time. And finally, the advice is make the most of life. This is the fun part. It's kind of what I talked about last week, is that when it comes down to life, we have two choices. We can choose to be miserable, or we can choose to make the most of our lives. The teacher says, considering the absurdity, the inability to know the reasons why, the teacher concludes that the best that we can do, here's his advice, that the best that we can do is to be happy and enjoy ourselves. The absurdity of life, when things happen and we don't know the reasons, the best we can do is make the most of it, whatever it is. It's kind of like Paul saying that rejoice in the Lord always. Notice that Paul doesn't say rejoice always. Instead, Paul says rejoice in the Lord always. Life isn't always happy. There's not always an occasion to rejoice in life, but there's always an occasion to rejoice in the Lord. When we're making God that reason, when we're focusing on God in our life, then we can find a way to rejoice in life and to make the most of it. Look at Jesus. So one of the criticisms of Jesus has always been my favorite, is that Jesus was addressing some of his opponents, and Jesus said, look at them. They're looking at me, and they said, look at this guy. He's a drunkard, he's a glutton, he's a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Of all the descriptions that you've ever given of Jesus in your life, the one description he gives of himself is being a drunkard and a glutton. Did you know that? Jesus didn't describe himself much, but when he did, he described himself as a drunkard and a glutton. Now, why would someone describe Jesus that way? Because part of what Jesus came to do is to show us what relationships are all about. Jesus in his life didn't mope around and fast. Jesus in his life didn't grieve or be solemn, put on religious appearances. Jesus came, pardon me this, to party. He did, in a good way. Why aren't you fasting like your disciples? Because the bridegroom is at the feast and it is time to celebrate. Jesus enjoyed his life. He enjoyed being with people. And today, he gives us a feast that is much like a wedding feast. Or view this table this way today. Is that, imagine a funeral that you've gone to. That was maybe very hard to get through, lots of tears, the songs that always get you, and maybe the occasional story that brings a smile. But just think of how different the funeral lunches are from the funeral services themselves. Funerals take on sort of somber tones, as they should because it's a time of loss. But I have never been to some more raucous dinners than end up happening after a funeral. Funeral dinners can be a lot of fun because you're remembering, you're celebrating. That's where you're connecting with family. That's what this table is. This is not a table that we should come to solemn as if someone has died. Instead, this is a table we come to today because someone is alive in us. So in our life, when we draw on the grace and the strength and life that is at this table, we have two choices. And I believe it's only two. And I believe it's especially when adversity comes our way. We have two choices. We can choose to be miserable, or we can choose to make the most of our life. And that's what Jesus did when choosing a cross. Choosing a cross could have been miserable for anyone. But instead, Jesus made the most of it, and beyond Goldilocks zones and beyond creative miracles, we are here most of all because Jesus made the most of the cross for us. So my friends, life can be absurd. I don't have all the answers, and I can't tell you all the reasons. I just know that can be unproductive in our lives. Instead, as believers and as a church, we must make God the sole reason on which we base our life. Because Christ will lead us forward. Christ gives us the grace we need to move on from the past, and Jesus directs us to a life that only He can show us. So amid the absurdity of life, I hope I have given you a way from this Bible to find a little more meaning in your life. To go say, what, sometimes things happen, but I'm going to trust God, and He's going to get me through it.